The morning Margaret Holloway walked her back 40 and came inside without so much as picking up a shovel. The talk started before noon. It was the first week of November, and the flat grain country of central Kansas was doing what it always did when the harvest was finished and the fields lay bare. The men were already thinking about spring. Cover crops to turn under, soil amendments to order, whether to rotate to milo or stay with winter wheat. The conversations happened at the co-op, at the diner on Birch Street, at the grain elevator where the line moved slow enough that you could settle most of the world's problems before you got to the front. Everyone had an opinion about what you did with your ground in the months between harvest and planting. Leaving it was not one of the accepted options. Margaret had farmed the Holloway place alone for 3 years, since the February her husband Carl had died of a stroke between the barn and the back door on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She had found him in the snow, his coffee still warm on the kitchen counter. She was 54 years old, had lived on that land for 27 years, and had spent every one of those years watching Carl make the decisions. She had helped, she had learned, she had been present for all of it. But the deciding had been his, and now it was hers, and the neighbors were watching to see what that would look like in practice. If you've ever been dismissed simply because of who you are, your age, your gender, or your circumstances, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are carrying the most important knowledge. Welcome back. Most of them had been kind enough about it. A few had been quietly helpful. But kind and helpful are not the same as taking seriously, and Margaret Holloway had understood from the first spring alone that there was a particular kind of attention people paid to a woman farming without a man, the kind that was waiting, not unkindly, for confirmation that she needed assistance she hadn't asked for. So when she left her south field untouched going into winter, the attention became something else. Dale Fensky, who ran the section adjacent to the Holloway place on the east, mentioned it to his brother at Thanksgiving. "She's not even going to disk it down," he said, in the tone of a man who had found something that troubled him genuinely. His brother, who farmed his own ground near Pratt, asked if maybe she was having equipment trouble. Dale shook his head. "She's got equipment. She just walked it and came back in." His wife said maybe she knew what she was doing. Dale looked at his coffee and didn't answer, which was an answer. Ray Kettner, who had been farming in Reno County for 38 years and considered himself something of an authority on what happened to bare ground over a hard Kansas winter, said it plainly to anyone who'd listen at the co-op: "That field is going to blow. March comes, she'll have nothing left but subsoil." He wasn't being cruel. He was being Ray Kettner, which was the same thing with better intentions behind it. The Holloway South field was 38 acres of silta loam that had been producing consistently for as long as anyone in the county could remember. Carl had kept it in good shape, rotating diligently, watching his organic matter numbers with the attentiveness of a man who understood that the soil was the actual asset, not the equipment or the building or even the land itself. What Carl had never quite solved, what nobody on that stretch of county road had ever quite solved, was the wind erosion problem that came every March without fail. The fields in that basin sat exposed to the southwest, and when the winter wheat country dried out and the winds came up in early spring, the topsoil went with them. You could see it from the road, that reddish-brown haze that hung low over the fields on a bad day, the county's history blowing past at 40 miles an hour. Everybody lost some. Everybody accepted it. Everybody called it part of the deal. Margaret had been watching that haze since the day she arrived on the Holloway place as a new wife in her late 20s, and she had been thinking about it more seriously since Carl died, since the farm became hers to keep or lose entirely on her own decisions. What she had found, in the long, quiet evenings of her first winter alone, was a box of agricultural bulletins and extension publications that Carl had collected over the decades and never quite got around to reading. He had been a man of practice rather than theory, which was not a criticism. Practice had kept the land good. But the bulletin sat in a cardboard box in the office corner, and Margaret had started reading them the way you read things when you have evenings and no one to fill them. One bulletin, from the Kansas State Extension Program, dated from the mid-1980s, had a section on what it called standing residue management. The principle was plain enough once you read it. A field left with its harvest stubble standing through winter catches snow, slows wind at the surface, and holds soil in ways that a tilled or disked field simply cannot. The stubble breaks the wind's momentum at ground level. Snow accumulates in the spaces between stalks rather than blowing past. And when spring comes, the moisture that snow represents stays in the field rather than running off frozen ground. The soil itself, undisturbed by fall tillage, holds its structure. The erosion that everybody in the county treated as inevitable was, at least in part, a consequence of something they were doing to themselves. If you have ever been told that your way of seeing things is wrong simply because it is different from the way it has always been done, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. What Margaret Holloway was about to find out is something that quiet, careful people have always known. Patience is not weakness. It is the long game being played while everyone else is watching the short one. Margaret had not gone into the winter with certainty. She had gone into it with a hypothesis and a 38-acre test case, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has nothing left to prove to anyone except herself and the land she is responsible for. She had not told anyone what she was doing or why. When Dale Fensky stopped at the fence one afternoon in late October and asked if she was having trouble getting to the south field, she had said, simply, that she was leaving it for now. He had nodded in a way that meant he did not understand but was not going to push it, and she had walked back toward the barn while he stood at the fence a moment longer than necessary. She spent November reading everything she could find about winter residue and soil conservation and what the research actually showed when you stripped away the habits and assumptions that had built up around farming practice like scar tissue. She drove to the county extension office in Hutchinson on a gray Tuesday and spoke for an hour with the agronomist there, a woman named Susan Pierce who was younger than Margaret had expected and who listened to her questions with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what was being asked. Susan confirmed what the bulletin had described and added to it. The data on standing residue was not new, she said. It had been established for decades. The problem was cultural. Fall tillage was what people did because it was what people had always done, because it made the fields look finished, because leaving stubble standing felt like leaving work undone. There was no technical reason to disc in the fall. There were technical reasons not to. Margaret drove home on the highway with the flat land opening out around her in every direction and thought about all the things that people did because they had always done them, and whether Carl had known this, and whether it would have mattered to him if he had. She thought he would have been interested. He had been a man who liked being right, and he would have liked to be right about this. December settled in the way December settles in central Kansas, which is to say without ceremony and without mercy. The temperature dropped, the sky took on the white-gray flatness of a closed door, and the wind came out of the northwest with the blunt persistence it always brought to that country. Margaret's south field stood as she had left it, the harvest stubble of the corn crop rising 8 to 10 inches from the surface, stiff and pale in the cold, running in rows across the full 38 acres. Her neighbors' fields lay flat and dark and open to whatever the sky wanted to do to them. The first snow came in the second week of December, a dry, driven snow that blew nearly horizontal across the county. Margaret walked her field lines the morning after it passed and saw what the bulletin had described. In her standing stubble, snow had caught and held. It lay in drifts between the rows, accumulated around the bases of the stalks, held in place by the structure the residue provided. The field had kept what the sky had given it. Across the fence, Dale Fensky's disked field was scoured nearly clean. The snow that had fallen on bare ground had simply blown past, driven by the same wind that had delivered it, and piled against the windbreaks and the road ditches and the fence lines where it would do nobody's fields any good at all. Margaret stood at the fence line for a long moment in the cold, looking from her field to Dale's and back again, and then she went inside and wrote down what she had seen in the same spiral notebook she'd been keeping since October. She didn't say anything to anyone. She kept her own counsel the way she had learned to keep it, which was without effort, because she had found that people rarely heard things until the evidence was in front of them in a form they couldn't argue with. February brought 2 more significant snowfalls and a 3-day stretch of wind that Ray Kettner said afterward was the worst he had seen since 1987. Margaret's field held. The stubble, though bent and worn by January's ice, still stood enough to catch and break. When she walked it in the wind's aftermath, the surface was rough but intact. The soil was where it was supposed to be. Ray Kettner's field, which lay on the south side of the township road half a mile away, had a new feature that February. A broad, shallow scour along its western edge, where the wind had gotten underneath and lifted. He'd lost maybe 2 inches of topsoil across a quarter of the field. He didn't talk about it at the co-op, but everyone knew, because everyone drives past everyone's fields in a county that small. March came. In the almanac of Reno County, Kansas, March is when the argument about what you did in fall gets settled one way or the other. The ground thaws unevenly, the winds shift to the southwest, and the combination of loose soil and dry surface air creates conditions that have been blowing topsoil off the high plains since before any of them were farming it. The question in any given year is how much you lose and whether you can afford it. Margaret had been watching the weather forecasts since the last week of February. A warm, dry, windy pattern was coming, the kind that the Extension Service had been flagging in its weekly advisories. She walked her south field on the 1st of March and took notes on what she saw. The surface was intact. The soil structure was visible in sections where the residue had broken down naturally over the winter, dark and granular and cohesive in a way that tilled soil would not have been after a winter of freeze-thaw cycling. The field looked, she thought, like it had been left alone to do what soil does when you leave it alone, which was to maintain itself. The winds came March 7th and stayed for 4 days. On the second day, Margaret stood at her kitchen window and watched the haze rise from the fields to the south and west of her property, that familiar reddish-brown suspension of someone's topsoil traveling toward the state line. She could see it clearly from where she stood. She could see more precisely where it was coming from and where it was not. Her south field was not contributing to the haze. The residue had done what 40 years of bulletins said it would do. It had held the surface. The wind was moving across it rather than through it, breaking at the stubble rather than finding purchase in exposed and loosened soil. What was blowing off the neighboring fields was not blowing off hers. She did not go outside and look at the neighbors' fields. She stayed at her window with her coffee and watched the wind work on the county and felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph, but was adjacent to it, the feeling of having been right in a way that was too costly to the people around her to feel entirely good about. The damage across the county that week was measurable. Ray Kettner lost the better part of 3 inches from his southwest field, the one that had been his most productive piece of ground. Dale Fenske found, when the wind stopped and he could walk his east field, that the corner section nearest the road had scoured down to subsoil in a patch that would take years to rebuild if it ever came back fully. Tom Birch, who farmed the section south of the Holloway place and had laughed at the standing stubble in December, spent a week in March trying to understand why his yield projections were going to need revising before he had even planted. They came to her in the ways that people in farming country come when they have been proven wrong, and know it. Not with fanfare. Not with apology. With boots and questions, the most honest currency available. Dale Fenske came on a Thursday, 8 days after the winds had stopped. He drove his truck to the end of Margaret's lane and sat there for a moment before getting out, which she observed from the barn. When he walked up, he had his hands in his jacket pockets and a look on his face that she recognized from the mirror, the look of a person assembling what they want to say before they say it. He looked at the south field for a while, without speaking. The residue was laid down now, flattened by wind and weather, but the field surface was intact, visibly different from the scoured and loosened fields on either side of it. "You going to tell me what you did here?" he asked. "I didn't do anything," she said. "That's what I did. I left it." He was quiet for a moment. "The bulletin." "What bulletin?" "There's an extension bulletin. Susan Pierce told me about it after I asked her about your field. Standing residue management." He said it carefully, like a term he had learned recently, and was still calibrating. "There is," Margaret said. "You read it. Carl had it in a box. I found it the first winter." Dale looked at the field again. The wind was quiet today. The surface sat still and dark and intact under the pale March sun. "I lost about 3 acres off the east corner," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could tell by the way he held his shoulders. "I know," she said, without elaboration. He asked her about the specifics. What height of residue was enough, what crop it worked best with, whether you had to adjust your spring planting to account for working through standing stalks. She answered everything she knew, referred him to Susan Pierce for what she didn't, and went inside to make coffee when he said he had to get back to his own ground. Ray Kettner came 2 days after Dale, and he was characteristically direct about it, which Margaret respected even if she did not entirely enjoy. "I was wrong," he said, standing at the gate, not even coming up the lane. "How wrong was I?" She thought about that and said, honestly, that the research suggested most of the wind erosion in the county over the past 4 decades was preventable. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the road. Then he said, "That's a hard thing to hear." She agreed that it was. The county extension office ran a field day on the Holloway Place in June, the first of what would become an annual event. Susan Pierce spoke. Margaret spoke briefly, more briefly than people expected, because she had found that the field explained itself better than she could, and all you had to do was bring people out to see it. 17 farmers from the county and 2 from adjacent counties attended. 3 of them came back in August with more questions. By the following fall, standing residue was being discussed at the co-op in the same matter-of-fact way that any established practice gets discussed once enough people have tried it and found it works. Dale Fensky was the first to do his full spread in standing residue that year. Ray Kettner took longer, but he came around, which was, everyone agreed, the more remarkable thing. Margaret Holloway did not make a production of any of it. She continued farming the way she had farmed since Carl died, which was carefully and without waste, and with the particular attentiveness of someone who knows that the land does not forgive carelessness and does not reward assumption. She kept her notebook. She attended the field days. She answered questions when people asked them. What she thought about, in the evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet, was the box of bulletins in Carl's office, and how long they had sat there, and what the accumulated cost of that had been to the county over the years when the wind came in March and the soil went with it. She did not think this with anger. She had been a farmer long enough to know that everyone is working with what they have and that time and attention are not evenly distributed, and that the gap between what is known and what is practiced is not a gap of intelligence but of opportunity, of who had the particular winter with the particular quiet to sit down with a cardboard box and start reading. She had been given that winter by the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She thought Carl would have understood that, and she thought he would have liked seeing the south field in March with the surface intact while the wind moved over it and passed it toward some other county, some other farmer's ground. She thought he would have stood at the fence with his coffee and watched the haze rise to the south and said something dry and accurate about the situation, the way he had always said things, and she would have agreed with him, and they would have stood there together for a while longer before the work called them back. He wasn't there to stand with her. But the field held, and the knowledge was out of the box and into the county now, and the ground that Carl had spent 30 years keeping good was in better shape than it had ever been, and would be for longer than either of them had left to see. The land keeps what you give it room to keep. The hard part is learning to give it room, and finding in yourself the willingness to be still when everything around you is insisting on motion. Margaret Holloway found that willingness in the worst winter of her life. The field remembers. And now, so does the county. If Margaret's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe. Stories like this one remind us that wisdom doesn't announce itself. It just shows up when the storm does.